Welcome to this video about service of the Danfoss ICLX 32-65 two-step solenoid valves. In this video, we'll give you some tips how to do an efficient service of the ICLX 32-65 two-step solenoid valves, which you see an example of here, to ensure safe and reliable valve operation and minimum service costs. Therefore, we will show you how to correctly isolate the valve from the system and drain it before service, how to correctly pressure equalize the valve internally before service, how to correctly service or replace the EVM pilot valves, how to correctly service or replace the external pilot connector. We will also show you how to correctly replace the valve body gasket, how to correctly replace the function module if needed, how to correctly replace the O-ring in the top cover, how to correctly replace the O-rings on the function module. Finally, we will show you how to correctly replace the PTFE valve plate on the main piston if needed, how to correctly replace the PTFE valve plate on the bleed piston if needed, and how to correctly recharge the valve and connect it to the system. The complete ICLX 32-65 two-step solenoid valves consist of valve body and top cover with function module, as seen here. The valves are controlled by two EVM pilot valves and an external pilot connector. This video covers the valve sizes 32, 40, 50, and 65, and these valves come with various types of connections. In this video, we demonstrate the service of the ICLX 50, but the service procedure is the same for all valve sizes and variants. The service of the valve is done with the valve located on a workbench, as seen here, but the procedures of valve disassembly, valve parts replacement, and valve reassembly are the same for the valve located in a refrigeration system. Here you see the tools needed for the service of the ICLX 32-65 two-step solenoid valves. This includes Danfoss valve tester with code number 018F0091, special tools, torque wrench with hexagon profile tool sizes 16, 17, and 20, female hexagon size 16 for ICLX 32-40, male hexagon size 17 for ICLX 50, and male hexagon size 20 for ICLX 65. Spanners, pliers, Allen keys, screwdrivers, protection plugs to seal connections for pilot valves and connector. So let us get started with the valve service. Before servicing the ICLX 32-65 two-step solenoid valves, it is very important to do the following steps. Isolate the valve from the system, drain refrigerant from the valve, check and ensure that there is no refrigerant pressure before disassembly of the valve. Finally, disconnect the electrical supply to the coils mounted on the EVM pilot valves and disconnect the refrigerant supply to the external pilot connector. In some cases, the valve might be internally pressurized by refrigerant, both upstream and downstream the valve. This internal refrigerant pressure can be equalized by manually opening the valve, this by activating the manual operating spindle. Therefore, firstly remove the coils from the pilot valves. Insert a screwdriver between coil and pilot valve and twist the screwdriver to loosen the coil. Then remove the coils, coil O-rings, and the pilot valve ID labels. Loosen and remove the cap from the top cover and manual operating spindle by rotating it counterclockwise. Then carefully rotate the manual operating spindle counterclockwise to open the valve. Keep rotating the spindle until it contacts the mechanical stop in top position. Do not use excessive torque when the spindle is in top position. Finally, mount the Danfoss valve tester onto the EVM normally closed pilot valve armature tube to manually open it to release possible trapped pressurized refrigerant. Then remove the valve tester again. The ICLX valve is now pressure equalized and ready for further service. We recommend to always inspect the EVM pilot valves and the external pilot connector and service them as needed before doing any further service of the complete ICLX valve. This way we also avoid possible damage of these parts during ICLX valve service, and it makes the ICLX valve handling and service easier. Therefore, to inspect and service the EVM pilot valves, do the following. Rotate the EVM pilot valves counterclockwise to remove them from the top cover. Replace the fiber gaskets and the EVM armature O-rings. If the EVM pilot valves are worn and with malfunction, then replace the complete EVM valves. To inspect and service the external pilot connector, do the following. Rotate the pilot connector counterclockwise to remove it from the top cover. Replace the fiber gasket, O-ring and alloy gasket. If the pilot connector is worn and in malfunction, then replace the complete connector. Finally, if available, we recommend to insert protection plugs in the pilot connections to protect them during the further valve service. Alternatively, protect the connections in another way. To remove the ICLX 32-65 top cover with function module, firstly loosen the bolts. Remove 2 of the bolts, leaving 2 bolts partly fixed to the valve body as a safety measure should there by accident still be refrigerant pressure inside the valve. Insert 2 screwdrivers between top cover and valve body. Push the screwdrivers downwards to loosen and lift the top cover with function module from the valve body. Slightly lift the top cover by hand to ensure that there is no refrigerant pressure inside the valve. Then remove the remaining 2 bolts. Finally, carefully lift and remove the top cover with function module. If the valve body gasket is located in the valve body, then carefully remove it by hand. Do not use a sharp tool to remove the gasket, since this might damage the gasket groove. To be able to remove the function module from the top cover to further inspect and service these parts, then we firstly need to loosen the manual operating spindle from the top cover. Therefore, remove the spindle sign, locking ring, and locking washer from the manual operating spindle. Then carefully rotate the spindle clockwise until it is free from the threads in the top cover. If needed, push the spindle by hand to fully free it from the top cover threads. Remove the function module from the top cover as follows. Insert 2 screwdrivers in the slots on the side of the function module. Carefully press the screwdrivers downwards on the top cover to loosen and lift the function module. Then carefully remove the function module from the top cover. Be careful not to scratch the surfaces or damage the seal seat of the function module during removal. Carefully remove the O-ring from the top cover. Be careful not to scratch and damage the O-ring groove. If the function module is worn and with malfunction, then replace the complete function module. Alternatively, just replace the O-rings on the function module and reassemble the ICLX valve. This will show you later in this video. If the PTFE valve plates on the piston assembly inside the function module insert need replacement, then further disassembly of the function module is needed. This will show in the following. To be able to disassemble the function module to replace the PTFE valve plates on the piston assembly, then we firstly need to remove the manual operating spindle from the function module. Therefore, fix the end of the manual operating spindle in the workbench. Then carefully rotate the spindle bolt counterclockwise to loosen and remove it from the spindle. Finally, lift and remove the function module from the manual operating spindle. Again, be careful not to scratch the surfaces or damage the seal seat of the function module during removal. The piston assembly is fixed inside the function module insert by a compressed spring plate and a retaining ring. Therefore, we need to use a special tool to compress the spring and loosen and remove the retaining ring so that we can remove the piston assembly from the function module insert. This can be done as follows. Fix the special tool in the workbench. Carefully mount the function module insert onto the tool. Mount the tool top and nut and rotate the nut clockwise to press the spring-loaded spring plate downwards until the retaining ring is visible and unloaded from the spring force. Carefully use 2 screwdrivers to remove the retaining ring from the insert. Then rotate the tool nut counterclockwise to release the spring force. Carefully remove the tool nut and top and remove the spring plate and spring from the insert. Remove the insert from the tool. Finally, press the piston assembly out of the insert. If needed, use the special tool and a torque wrench tool to remove the piston assembly, as seen here in this example. Again, be careful not to scratch the surface or damage the seal seat of the function module insert during removal of the piston assembly. Carefully remove the O-rings from the function model insert. Be careful not to scratch and damage the O-ring grooves. The piston assembly consists of a bleed piston with a spring-loaded main piston fixed inside the bleed piston. The main piston is screwed together with the main piston top to keep it fixed and spring-loaded inside the bleed piston. Therefore, to remove the main piston from the bleed piston, do the following. Replace the two short M5 bolts in the main piston top with either two steel pins or two longer M5 bolts. In this example, we use two longer M5 bolts. Fix the main piston top with the bolts in the workbench. Insert the hexagon tool, in this example male size 17 for ICLX 50, into the sealing retainer. Rotate counterclockwise to loosen and remove it from the main piston. If needed, you can now replace the PTFE valve plate on the main piston. Be careful not to damage the seal seat of the main piston during disassembly. To complete the removal of the main piston, press on the main piston top and insert a screwdriver into the holes in the main piston rod. Fix the main piston top in the workbench and rotate the screwdriver counterclockwise to release the spring force and loosen the main piston from the main piston top. Carefully remove the bleed piston, main piston, and the spring. Be careful not to damage the seal seat of the main piston during disassembly. The PTFE valve plate is fixed to the bleed piston by a sealing retainer, which is screwed into the bleed piston. Therefore, to remove the PTFE valve plate from the bleed piston, do the following. To loosen and remove the sealing retainer, it is recommended to fix the bleed piston carefully in a mandrel with 3-point suspension. Carefully fix the piston at surface position 1 as illustrated. Alternatively, carefully fix the piston in a workbench as shown here. Use a special tool as shown and carefully rotate the tool counterclockwise to loosen and remove the sealing retainer. Finally, if needed, replace the PTFE valve plate. Be careful not to damage or deform the bleed piston surfaces during PTFE valve plate removal. You can use different available service kits to replace worn valve parts during reassembly of the ICLX 32-65 two-step solenoid valves. Here you see the available service kits for ICLX 32-65 valves. These are inspection kit, which includes fiber gaskets, O-rings, and alloy rings. Repair kit, which includes fiber gaskets, O-rings, alloy rings, steel ring, and PTFE valve plates. Overall kit, which includes fiber gaskets, O-rings, alloy rings, top cover with function module, EVM normally closed and normally open pilot valves, and external pilot connector. Please look for spare parts details for the different ICLX valve sizes in the spare parts catalog, which is available on danfoss.com. So let us start the valve assembly using spare parts from these service kits. If the PTFE valve plate of the bleed piston has been replaced, then assemble the bleed piston as follows. Firstly, clean the PTFE valve plate groove and then carefully mount the PTFE valve plate. To mount and tighten the sealing retainer, it is recommended to fix the bleed piston carefully in a mandrel with 3-point suspension. Carefully fix the piston at surface position 1 as illustrated. Alternatively, carefully fix the piston in a workbench as shown here. Use a special tool as shown and carefully rotate the sealing retainer clockwise and tighten it to the specified torque. Be careful not to damage or deform the bleed piston surfaces during assembly. If the piston assembly has been disassembled to replace the PTFE valve plate on the bleed piston, then assemble the bleed and main pistons as follows. Firstly, clean the PTFE valve plate groove in the main piston and then carefully mount the PTFE valve plate. Then carefully mount the main piston into the bleed piston. Mount the spring onto the main piston rod inside the bleed piston. Mount the main piston top into the bleed piston. Press the retaining ring on the piston top together while pushing the piston top carefully into the bleed piston. Keep pressure on the piston top while rotating the main piston clockwise to fix the piston top to the main piston rod. To complete the piston assembly, press on the piston top and insert a screwdriver into the holes in the main piston rod. Fix the piston top with bolts in the workbench. Rotate the screwdriver and main piston clockwise and tighten it to the piston top with the specified torque. Remove the piston assembly from the workbench, press on the piston top to remove the screwdriver, and press a few times on the piston top to ensure that the main piston moves smoothly inside the bleed piston. Be careful not to damage the seal seat of the main piston during assembly. Fix the piston assembly to the workbench again. If the fixing ring for the manual operating spindle has been removed during disassembly, then mount it into the main piston. Clean the sealing retainer and the main piston sealing area, mount the sealing retainer and rotate it clockwise to tighten it to the main piston. Insert the hexagon tool, in this example male size 17 for ICLX 50, into the sealing retainer. Rotate it further clockwise and tighten it with the specified torque. Replace the two long M5 bolts or steel pins, if using such, with the short M5 bolts. Rotate the M5 bolts clockwise and tighten them firmly. Be careful not to damage the seal seat of the main piston during assembly. Before mounting the O-rings onto the function model insert, firstly clean the O-ring grooves in the insert. Lubricate the O-rings with refrigerant oil so that they are not damaged during mounting. Then carefully mount the O-rings. The piston assembly needs to be pressed into the function model insert and fixed inside it by a compressed spring plate, and a retaining ring. First step is to carefully press the piston assembly into the function model insert. This can be done as follows. Firstly, lubricate the insert inside with refrigerant oil where there is contact with the piston assembly. Mount the piston assembly into the insert. We recommend to use a special tool to press the piston assembly correctly into the insert. Therefore, mount the special tool through the center hole of the piston assembly and fix the tool in the workbench. Mount the tool top and nut and rotate the nut clockwise to press the piston assembly into the insert. Be careful not to damage the piston assembly and internal surfaces of the insert. Then remove the tool nut and top and press by hand the piston assembly fully into place. Next step is to use the special tool to compress the spring inside the function model insert so that the spring plate and retaining ring can be mounted. This can be done as follows. Fix the special tool in the workbench. Carefully mount the function model insert with piston assembly onto the tool. Mount the spring with spring plate into the insert. Mount the tool top and nut and rotate the nut clockwise to press the tool top and spring-loaded spring plate downwards until the retaining ring groove is visible. Carefully mount the retaining ring into the groove in the insert. Then rotate the tool nut counterclockwise and remove the nut and top. Push on the spring plate by hand a few times to ensure that the retaining ring and spring plate are located correctly. Be careful not to scratch the surfaces or damage the seal seat of the function model insert during assembly. To assemble a manual operating spindle and the function model, do the following. Fix the end of the manual operating spindle in the workbench. Carefully mount the function model onto the spindle. Then apply Loctite onto the spindle bolt threads. Mount the bolt onto the spindle, rotate the bolt clockwise and tighten it firmly to the spindle. Finally, remove the assembly from the workbench. Again, be careful not to scratch the surfaces or damage the seal seat of the function model during assembly. Before mounting the O-ring into the top cover, firstly clean the O-ring groove in the top cover. Lubricate the O-ring with refrigerant oil so that it is not damaged during later assembly. Then carefully mount the O-ring. Mount the function model into the top cover as follows. Carefully mount the function model into the top cover. Press by hand firmly on the function model until it is pressed fully into place in the top cover. Again, be careful not to scratch the surfaces or damage the seal sheet of the function model during assembly. After mounting the function model into the top cover, then the manual operating spindle can be fully mounted and fixed onto the top cover. Therefore, push the spindle by hand through the top cover until it contacts the top cover threads. Then carefully rotate the spindle counterclockwise until it contacts the mechanical stop in top position. Do not use excessive torque when the spindle is in top position. Mount the locking washer, locking ring, and spindle sign. Before mounting the valve body gasket, firstly clean the gasket groove in the valve body. Then mount the gasket. You do not need to lubricate the gasket. Carefully mount the top cover with function model onto the valve body in any rotational direction as needed. Press firmly by hand the top cover into place on the valve body. Then mount the bolts and cross-tighten them with the torque specified here. Remove the protection plugs from the pilot connections on the top cover and clean the connections. If not already done, as mentioned earlier in this video, then replace the fiber gaskets and O-rings for the external pilot connector and pilot valves. Then mount the pilot connector and pilot valves onto the top cover as follows. For the external pilot connector, do the following. Ensure that the O-ring and fiber gasket are correctly mounted on the pilot connector. Mount the connector onto the pilot connection on the side of the top cover. Rotate the connector clockwise and tighten it with the specified torque. For the EVM pilot valves, do the following. Ensure that the O-ring, fiber gasket, and ID label are correctly mounted on the valves. Mount the EVM normally closed version valve onto the pilot valve connection closest to the external pilot connection. Mount the EVM normally open version valve onto the other pilot valve connection. Rotate the pilot valves clockwise and tighten them with the specified torque. Finally, mount the coil O-rings onto the valve armature tubes. When connecting the pilot connector to external refrigerant supply, ensure that the alloy ring is correctly mounted inside the connection. To deactivate the manual operating spindle, do the following. Carefully rotate the manual operating spindle clockwise until it is in bottom position where the locking ring contacts the locking washer on top of the packing gland. Do not use excessive torque when the spindle is in bottom position. Ensure that the cap gasket is correctly mounted inside the cap, and then mount the cap onto the top cover and manual operating spindle. Rotate the cap clockwise and tighten it firmly. Mount the coils onto the pilot valves. Press firmly by hand until the coils click into place on the pilot valve armature tubes, this ensuring a tight connection between the coils and pilot valves. Finally, connect the electrical supply to the coils mounted on the EVM pilot valves and connect the refrigerant supply to the external pilot connector. After completing the assembly of the ICLX 32-65 two-step solenoid valves, ensure to do the following steps. Connect the valve to the system, charge refrigerant to system and valve, check and ensure that the refrigerant pressure is equalized in the valve and system. Finally, perform a functional test of the ICLX valve according to the instructions given in the ICLX installation guide. This is available on Danfoss.com. You have now completed service of the ICLX 32-65 two-step solenoid valves. So now you know how to correctly isolate the valve from the system and drain it before service, correctly pressure equalize the valve internally before service, correctly service or replace the EVM pilot valves, correctly service or replace the external pilot connector, correctly replace the valve body gasket, correctly replace the function module if needed, correctly replace the O-ring in the top cover, correctly replace the O-rings on the function module, correctly replace the PTFE valve plate on the main piston if needed, correctly replace the PTFE valve plate on the bleed piston if needed, and finally, how to correctly recharge the valve and connect it to the system. All this ensuring a safe and reliable valve operation with minimum service costs. Have a look at the other online learnings about Danfoss valves. Thanks for watching.